Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our discussion on distributive bargaining. In this section, we're going to have a close look at the fundamental strategies used in distributive bargaining, as well as the 4 what they call tactical tasks. There are 4 tactical tasks identified, and each one is a cluster of tactics that help to reach a bigger objective related to a particular strategy. So we're going to have an in-depth look at those. The first one is to push for settlement near the opponent's resistance point. Now, of course, we need to build up some knowledge, as we discussed earlier, about what that resistance point could be. But our job is to try to get close as possible to that person's resistance point, because beyond the resistance point, the deal will probably fall apart. The other thing we need to do is get the other party to maybe change their resistance point. So this can happen if sometimes it could be us or our opponent may have an inaccurate view of what their position is in the negotiation. So one of the things we can do is, as we start to understand what their resistance point is, we might be able to find ways to get them to change their resistance point. So if we're selling something, let's say it's a Craigslist sale and we're doing a simple transaction. Let's say you're selling a computer like I did recently, and maybe the person offers a low price. So let's say your listed price is $500 and somebody offers $300. Now, as a seller, I don't take those things too seriously. That's just somebody just trying to lowball me. But if we have a chance to talk, maybe we can have a conversation so I don't get insulted by the low offer. I may just start talking to them and say, how did you come up with that number? Sometimes people will say things like, well, I just thought I'd take a shot, or I saw one that was similar and it was selling for less. And we might talk about what the computer is actually made out of, what are the technical elements of the computer, the specifications that may make it worth more than the one that the person looked at. In other words, there is a conversation there. So if they might have had a very low resistance point, I still don't know what that was, but if they did, I may be able to encourage them to shift to a higher level if we start to engage in a conversation that helps get them into a place where they're maybe more informed or more aware of what the comparisons really are. One little footnote here, this is not so much a separate strategy, but if the settlement range is negative, and what that means is that the resistance points don't intersect. So if we look at the idea of possibly selling a house, in part 1, we looked at the overlap that created a bargaining zone between two people, one buyer, one seller of a house. Let's say, for example, you want to sell a house and you list it for $450 and your resistance point is $420. And someone comes to see you, but they make you an offer of $380 and their resistance point is $410. Well, if the two people have pretty firm ideas of what their resistance points are, they're very attached to them and they don't want to change them, you have what's called a negative settlement or bargaining zone. So what happens is it becomes very, very difficult to actually create a deal, obviously, because somebody believes that their low resistance point is as low as it ever can be, and you've created perhaps a real maximum for yourself that you know. Maybe you can't get a mortgage for more than that, whatever it is. So what are the options? The only options that are left are to encourage the other person to maybe shift their resistance point, similar to what I was sharing about selling a computer. Or maybe we need to look at it. In other words, if we really love the house, maybe we need to look at it and say, well, maybe I can come up with another $10,000 or $15,000 to make it work. But this all comes out in the dialogue, and we have to be careful not to be offended or put off just because somebody's made an offer to us that we find is too low or too high, depending on what we're doing. And the last one is to convince the other party that the settlement is the best possible. And this is really something you may have done almost innately sometimes, that either through just your negotiation dialogue or through maybe some kind of evidence, you can show them that, look, this is the best I'm going to be able to do, and I'm not sure what else we can do to actually make this work if it's not agreeable to you. But in the end, really the conversation around convincing the other party needs to be backed up more than just saying this is the best there is. In other words, it's really helpful if you have some other information to show them. So for example, with the computer example I shared earlier, If I know that there are a whole bunch of computers like the one I have with the same specifications that are selling for more or the same as mine, the person who's given me a lowball offer may look at it and say, maybe I need to pay something in the 400 range or high 400 range if I want something like that. And then we can have a conversation that's less about my personality versus the other person's personality. And a footnote here that the keys to implementing these strategies is fundamentally about discovering the other party's resistance point and then influencing their resistance point in your favor. This is the cornerstone of these three main strategies. Next, we're going to look at 4 tactical tasks of negotiators. And what this means is really these are things we need to do in parallel with our strategies and other tactics to really make sure we manage the negotiation well and that we're not caught off guard. A couple of these are specific tactics, which I will identify to you, but the others are more things that we would do on an ongoing basis and support the strategies and tactics that we utilize. So the first one is to assess the other party's target, resistance point, and cost of terminating the negotiations. You're not going to have all that information given to you for the most part. So a lot of what we're doing here is doing it indirectly. So we try to determine the information the opponent used to set their target and resistance points because they will leave little clues along the way. That was mentioned in the first part of these video tutorials. They're going to say things, allude to things, act in certain ways that are going to give you information in some way that you can use to try to figure out what their target and resistance point are and what the cost of terminating the negotiation will be. In other words, what do they lose if the negotiation doesn't go through? And there are also sometimes direct pieces of information that you get. Sometimes your opponent will reveal certain information. If you have a good working relationship, this is not unusual. And so these 2 ways, directly and indirectly, will help you assess the other party's target, resistance point, and cost of terminating. The next one is to manage the other party's impression of your target and resistance point so that they have the impression you want them to have. So this means that you're presenting information in a way that leads them to believe in a way that helps you get what you want out of the negotiation. So one of the ways you can do this is by screening your behavior. So you're saying and doing as little as possible. Sometimes this might look like poker face where you don't show any expression. Sometimes it's simply masking emotional responses and so on to not leave any kind of clues for your opponent to take advantage of. The second thing you can do is almost the opposite of screening your behavior, and that's manipulating your behavior. In other words, you can present your facts or things you want to say in a way that enhance your position. This is sometimes referred to as selective presentation. In other words, you present what you feel will help you with the negotiation. You don't have to present every fact completely all the time. Another thing you can do is use what's called sort of false emotional reactions. So you can overplay something. It's kind of a way of using a bogey, which we'll talk about later, but this is really about basically faking a response to something to some degree to lead your opponent to believe one thing or another. So for example, if you're giving up something small, but you want your opponent to feel like it's a big thing, you might put on a bit of an air that it was a really difficult thing for you to give it up. But in fact, you're not minding at all because that might also lead them to give you something that's important to you in exchange for that. The third tactical task is about modifying the other party's perceptions of their own objectives. So what you're doing is having a conversation with them about what they're getting out of the deal. And in a way, you're kind of manipulating how they perceive their own gains out of the negotiation. So are their outcomes as attractive as they could be? Maybe you're able to convince them that if they do something differently, they'll actually get a better outcome. You can make the cost of getting what they want seem higher, both from negotiation and also from their circumstance that they're actually in. And then you can also make their demands and positions appear either more or less attractive to them depending on what suits you. So you can try to manipulate their own interpretation of what they're actually asking for. And then finally, one of the little things that can be helpful is to make any opening offers really precise. There's something about a precise number that adds more weight to it and seems like actual thought and calculation went into it. And the last tactical task is about manipulating the actual cost of delay or termination. So what you're basically telling your opponent is, if they delay or don't follow through on the negotiation or break off the negotiation, there's going to be problems for everybody. We can think of disruptive action. It could be something done by a union where they do some kind of job action because the management teams, negotiators broke off or are delaying the negotiation for some reason. We can develop alliances with other parties outside of the negotiation to help give us a little bit more power and maybe offer some leverage. And the other thing we can do is, if we know our opponent might be vulnerable if things are delayed, we might be able to use that to our advantage by throwing in little obstacles here and there, so it doesn't look like we're being directly manipulative, but it does put them under pressure because they may be more vulnerable.